World Championship Wrestling. 3 simple words that kickstart the hottest period in wrestling history. 3 simple words that serve as a warning to any wrestling promoter looking to take over the wrestling world. 3 simple words that conjure images of immense highs, yet utter incompetence. Formed from the ashes of several influential NWA territories, WCW stands as the second biggest wrestling promotion of all time. The last hope of the National Wrestling Alliance after the turbulent late 1980s, WCW was backed by the money of billionaire TV magnate Ted Turner in order to do what no one else in the industry had ever successfully done: directly take on the WWF and Vince McMahon at their own game. It wasn't an easy ride by any stretch, with everything from public fallouts and corporate tomfoolery to literal backstabbing and gross overspending, all hampering WCW's progress. However, due to the sheer bloody determination of a young hotshot executive called Eric Bischoff, WCW not only equaled WWF, but surpassed them, kicking off the Monday Night Wars in 1995 and dominating the wrestling landscape for several years. For those who lived it, these were halcyon days, where wrestling was not only cool to watch, but it was the thing to watch. With offices, dorms and schoolyards awash, with intense discussion and wild rumors every Tuesday morning. Would Sting turn up on Raw is War to face The Undertaker? Would Stone Cold Steve Austin march onto Nitro to take on Goldberg? It was the hottest wrestling has ever been, and probably ever will be. Eventually, all things must come to an end, and WCW's end was spectacular, going from the #1 must-see wrestling product in the world to an almost worthless dead brand in a little over 2 years. The self-destruction of WCW sent reverberations throughout the professional wrestling industry that took decades to rectify, with WWE ruling the roost unopposed for many years, as wrestling once again became little more than an odd sideshow in the eyes of the masses. I'm Ross Tweddle from Cultaholic Wrestling, and this is the rise and fall of World Championship Wrestling. Quite frankly, there would be no WCW without the Crockett family, whose involvement with professional wrestling dates back to the 1930s. The 30s are when pro wrestling was solidifying its identity, building upon the innovations pioneered by the Gold Dust trio of Toots Mond, Ed Lewis, and Billy Sandow in the 1920s. With interest in the legit submission-based grapple fests of Farmer Burns, George Hackenschmidt, and Frank Gotch starting to wane, the trio took the business even further down the path of entertainment, as some started to ask questions of the legitimacy of the sport. Fresh concepts such as tag team wrestling and maneuvers like the dropkick and suplex injected some excitement into wrestling. And soon, new ideas like the double countout and no contest had crowds enraptured. This new style was dubbed Slam Bang Western Style Wrestling, with the trio successfully taking wrestling from the burlesque halls to legitimate sporting auditoriums. The sky was frankly the limit for how popular wrestling could get. Whilst the Goldust trio would dominate the industry, they eventually dissolved in 1928, leaving the wrestling game wide open for whomever wanted it. This ultimately saw a new breed of promoters looking to put on the best matches, promote the best talent, and hopefully make bucket loads of that sweet, sweet cash. The Goldust trio's formula worked, and it worked well. Now it was time to see if it was a flash in the pan or a key to untold riches. With such high stakes at play, these new promoters were often super protective of their stars, and weren't always keen on playing nice with their peers. Such competition often got fierce, and numerous attempts were made to organize all these fledgling promotions, with the formation of the National Wrestling Association in 1930 being the first real step trying to unify several promotions under one governing body. However, this was not the NWA that would come to define an era. This was a more rigid, profit-focused organization, more akin to a protection racket than a sports coalition, if we're being honest. This was then built upon by the Trust, which saw several promoters agree to share profits and consolidate power, following on from an earlier trust in the 1910s. Both trusts were headed up by Jack Curley, with the second primarily a means for world champion Golden Greek Jim Londos to travel between promotions to draw huge gates for all involved. The trust fell apart after only a few years, whilst the original NWA quickly lost influence and relevance. Put simply, it was the Wild West for professional wrestling, and it was at times a huge mess. During these turbulent years, 25-year-old concert promoter Big Jim Crockett Sr. started running pro wrestling shows in Charlotte, North Carolina, setting up shop in 1935. Crockett would soon taste success and would end up running shows across both Carolinas and parts of Virginia using a whole host of federation names under one large umbrella called Jim Crockett Promotions. With the proper NWA, the National Wrestling Alliance, formally founded several years later in 1948, the territory system started to take flight. With the USA divided into well-defined promotional areas state to state, city to city, town to town. Each territory promoted their own champions and belt, whilst the NWA World Heavyweight Champion travelled from territory to territory, usually to make the local top star look good whilst keeping hold of the gold. This new NWA built upon the work of the original NWA and the Trust, yet looked to act more democratically than its predecessors. With talent sharing encouraged, disputes settled by vote and discussion, and the world champion decided by committee. As long as you were an alliance member, you were protected. And if you played nice and made friends in the right places, there was little chance that outside or outlaw promotions could successfully run your turf. A you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours type of deal. With his accomplishments, Crockett became the head of the Carolina Territories after joining the NWA in 1952, and also had control over parts of Virginia, with the Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling brand becoming the jewel of the Crockett crown. The NWA admittedly had its issues, but with healthy gates headed up by the likes of Lou Thesz and Pat O'Connor, business was steady across the board. Indeed, Crockett's gates grew throughout the 50s, with Big Jim becoming a major player in the NWA due to the continuing success of his territories. Crockett also became a trusted lieutenant to NWA President Sam Mushnick, gaining a measure of power and influence in the organization. The 1960s arguably saw the first major shakeups to the NWA. In 1960, the Minneapolis territory, headed up by Vern Gagne, ceded from the NWA due to political infighting, branching off on its own as the American Wrestling Association. Whilst the AWA would eventually play nice with the NWA, the feasibility of breaking away was no longer a what if, and was surely on the minds of the Capital Wrestling Corporation's Toots Mond and Vincent J. McMahon when yet more infighting arose over NWA World Champion Buddy Rogers in 1963. Come 1973, Jim Crockett Sr. would pass away aged 64, with his son, Jim Crockett Jr., taking control of JCP. Crockett Jr. made moves to streamline the business, and with Booker George Scott running creative, JCP put more focus on singles matches than tag team bouts, despite the latter being its bread and butter. Elsewhere in the NWA, Jim Barnett would become part owner of the main promotion in Georgia, returning to America after several years overseas, setting up a promotion in Australia called World Championship Wrestling. Barnett was brought in to steady the ship in Georgia, as the territory had its share of turmoil at the turn of the decade as wrestling's popularity waned as a whole. Under Barnett, Georgia did not stay rocky for long, as they had made a vital ally in Atlanta, an enterprise and broadcast mogul by the name of Ted Turner. As the 70s wore on, things started to turn in a more positive direction for the NWA. Harley Race, Jack Briscoe and the Funks defined the world title scene, a strong relationship was forged with Giant Baba in All Japan Pro Wrestling, and in Florida, Dusty Rhodes was starting to get over hugely with the fans. The decade saw the Georgia territory officially adopt the Georgia Championship Wrestling name for its main promotion, and in 1976 became the first nationally broadcast NWA affiliate. Widespread cable coverage made GCW immensely popular. Its exposure turned NWA talent into bona fide stars, and the ratings for GCW TV were instrumental in keeping Turner's WTCG Superstation afloat. Wrestling was relatively cheap to produce, and like today, it had a passionate, dedicated fan base who would go out of their way to tune in. Cat catnip to a TV president. GCW's product was so popular that it helped NWA back to the top of the American wrestling scene, with NWA President Sam Mushnick declaring Georgia the hottest territory in the country, as the AWA and WWF slipped behind NWA in the pecking order. Whilst you'd think GCW taking the NWA back to the summit would have been welcomed by all Alliance members, some were concerned at how advents in television broadcasting were changing the business, and how powerful the Georgia territory was becoming as a result. With the success and visibility of GCW, there were fears that Jim Barnett could have eyes on full national expansion, a big no-go in the NWA. Jim Crockett remained busy himself, forging connections with promoters across the land, and putting JCP products on local TV stations in areas without a local NWA presence. The NWA was serious business, and as promoters and promotions fell by the wayside, there were others waiting to swoop in and pick the bones, with Crockett quietly expanding as much as the agreements of the NWA would allow as his financial and political might grew. In 1980, Crockett was elected NWA president for the first time, and with the charismatic Ric Flair leading the way, Mid-Atlantic continued to grow. Soon, GCW booker Ole Anderson came on board to book Mid-Atlantic, at one point booking both territories at the same time. Add in the popularity of Eddie Graham's championship wrestling from Florida, and the Southeast was the backbone of the entire NWA. GCW TV's popularity continued, with the iconic Gordon Solie calling the action. And in 1982, GCW changed the branding of its main show to World Championship Wrestling, with Jim Barnett retaining ownership of the name from his Australia days. By this point, Mid-Atlantic and GCW were arguably the two biggest territories in the NWA, with the Von Erichs' Texas WCCW and the NWA affiliate territory Mid-South not far behind. And let's not forget about New York's WWF, the glitzy powerhouse of the Northeast that had quietly rejoined the alliance in 1971, but in many ways still marched the beat of its own drum. 1982 proved to be a seismic year for the industry, and the business would change forever when Vincent Kennedy McMahon bought the WWF from father Vince McMahon Sr. and his business partners. McMahon Jr. was very ambitious and at times ruthless, disregarding the established order of American pro wrestling to forge ahead on his own quest to make the WWF the de facto pro wrestling company on Earth. Such grand ambitions spat in the face of the NWA, as the alliance was built upon cooperation and democratic process. Even the AWA played nice with the NWA, despite ceding from the alliance. But McMahon was a different beast, and wanted the whole pro wrestling pie to himself, not content with a mere slice. Whilst the NWA appeared stronger than ever to the casual fan, there was more turmoil and infighting behind the scenes than ever before. The influential Sam Mushnick had retired in 1982 and was respected by many for his skills as a peacemaker, with Mushnick the glue that held many fragile alliances in place. With Mushnick gone, the days of the Wild West threatened to return, and the continued growth of cable TV meant that more promoters were starting to question their position as part of the NWA, when national expansion and untold riches were there for the taking. It wasn't just McMahon who had an eye on controlling the business, as Crockett himself had designs on expansion, although he was less overt about his plans. Crockett built upon his earlier work and spread his influence even further across America and into Canada, notably buying into Maple Leaf Wrestling in Toronto with respected NWA elder statesman Frank Tunney. However, Crockett's plans faced major upheaval when Tunney died in 1983. Tunney was an instrumental figure on the NWA board of directors and was seemingly the only remaining trusted voice of reason after Mushnick's retirement. With Tunney's passing, his nephew Jack Tunney took over the Toronto territory and turned his back on Crockett by partnering with Vince McMahon to allow WWF into Toronto. This is the same Jack Tunney who would go on to serve as WWF's on-screen president. Over in Georgia, a power struggle saw Jim Barnett clash with head booker and future Four Horsemen member Ole Anderson over several issues, with Anderson basically taking over the day-to-day running of the promotion. Moreover, Anderson was reportedly eyeing GCW's exit from the NWA, with the temptation of expansion seemingly too great to resist. exist. From Anderson's point of view, he was accusing Barnett of stealing money from the promotion, whilst Anderson put in all the work to make GCW run smoothly at the top of the NWA. Regardless, it must be noted that Anderson wasn't always the easiest person to work with. In fact, he was said to have been a bit of an arsehole at the best of times. Indeed, it was Anderson who flew off the handle at Vince McMahon Jr. at the 1983 annual NWA convention after McMahon had gone to war with GCW for control of Ohio. The convention itself was a mess. Jim Barnett left the board of directors to make way for Anderson. WWF ally Mike LaBelle also resigned from his position on the board, and McMahon Sr.'s seat on the board was questioned due to the aggressive practices of his son. Throw in the recent death of Tony, and the NWA was in severe disarray, with a power vacuum threatening to rock the alliance to its core. Pandemonium and yelling soon filled the air at the convention, with a lot of the ire pointed at McMahon Jr. Vince is said to have calmly stood up and quietly walked out of the meeting rather than engage in a war of words. McMahon Sr. would leave the NWA board of directors shortly after the convention, and Vince Jr. withdrew the WWF from the NWA for good. Barnett would ultimately have the last laugh on Ole Anderson. Although he still had his shares in GCW, Barnett began assisting McMahon behind the scenes in the WWF, helping Vince expand across America by purchasing local TV time slots, signing exclusivity deals with arenas, and running markets that would have been inaccessible had he stayed with the NWA. The WWF also found its way onto cable, striking up a relationship with the USA Network. But as ever, McMahon wanted more. Seeing GCW's plum 2-hour Saturday night TV slot on WTBS, McMahon went to Ted Turner himself and offered to buy the time slot, but Turner refused outright. McMahon needed another way in. Barnett eventually sold his shares in GCW to fellow shareholders Ole Anderson, Paul Jones, and the Briscoe brothers in 1983. The Briscoes would also clash with Ole, and they would end up selling their full controlling shares in Georgia to McMahon in early 1984, accepting Fed jobs in return. With true national expansion in his sights, McMahon set his chess pieces in place. He just needed to enact the next phase of his plan. The WWF now owned GCW, and therefore now also owned GCW's Saturday night time slot on WTBS. Vince McMahon had become the only promoter in America with a presence on cable, alongside his myriad national broadcast slots. It was time to roll out the WWF to new audiences. On Saturday, July the 14th, 1984, World Championship Wrestling on WTBS opened like many episodes before it. However, Gordon Solie was nowhere to be found. Instead, Solie's co-host Freddie Miller was flying solo and announced to viewers that WWF was here before introducing Vince McMahon. McMahon extolled the greatness of the WWF to his new viewers before cutting to some tag team action. So far, so good. Yet for GCW NWA fans, this was not what they tuned in for. This was not the gritty reality-based NWA wrestling. This was WWF's larger-than-life, bombastic sports entertainment. And to them, this was indeed a Black Saturday. To say loyal GCW fans didn't like this is an understatement. They flooded WTBS with complaints demanding a return to the wrestling they knew and loved. But it fell on deaf ears. GCW was not only dead, it was Vince McMahon's property, and he was going to make the WWF work on WTBS by any means necessary. The GCW fans voted with their thumbs and simply stopped watching what McMahon was force-feeding them. Over time, the ratings started to fall and fall and fall. It wasn't just GCW fans and the NWA who were angry at Vince McMahon though, as he had managed to piss off Ted Turner himself. The declining ratings were one thing, but the early days of Turner's TV ventures were bolstered exponentially by Georgia wrestling, in turn making Turner very loyal to those who had helped him make his name. Furthermore, when McMahon took over Georgia, Turner stipulated he stick to the tried and true studio wrestling style that had worked so well before, requiring WWF to broadcast live from Turner's Atlanta studios just like GCW had. McMahon ignored Turner, instead rolling out recaps and highlights of previous WWF shows from the glitzier arenas in the Northeast, with the occasional pre-taped studio bout featuring Georgia stars like the Briscoes thrown in as a bare minimum for Turner and the audience. Instead of cancelling Vince's prime Saturday night slot, Turner went to the drawing board, wanted to do right by viewers and stick it to McMahon. Turner wasn't going to give Vince the satisfaction of cancelling his show, nor was McMahon going to swallow his pride and throw in the towel. McMahon had the only wrestling show on WTBS, so Turner flipped that on its head by offering airtime to Bill Watts' Mid-South Wrestling, and to a new promotion called Championship Wrestling from Georgia, helmed by the apoplectic Ole Anderson. With Mid-South on Sunday afternoons and with CWG on Saturday mornings, McMahon faced direct competition on WTBS, with both shows soon eclipsing the WWF Saturday night slot in the ratings. The fans had let Ted Turner know that they enjoyed a certain style of wrestling, and by gum were they going to watch it over the WWF, no matter when it aired. McMahon was backed into a corner. With his nationwide expansion costing him a ton of money, his WTBS shows hemorrhaging ratings, and with a massive financial gamble known as WrestleMania on the horizon, he needed some quick cash or potentially face bankruptcy. McMahon had little choice but to bite the bullet and sell the WTBS TV slots to Jim Crockett for $1 million in early 1985, with Vince vowing that Crockett would choke on that million. You see, Crockett had not been sat idly whilst Vince McMahon was fighting Turner, Ole Anderson, the audience, and seemingly everyone else in a 50-mile radius. Seeing that the WWF's ever-growing threat could spell certain doom for every other promoter in the country, Crockett was trying to consolidate the NWA by transforming it into one super promotion, with the first Starrcade Supercard in November 1983 a significant show of force, with JCP talents dominating the card. Vince McMahon had tried to coax NWA World Heavyweight Champion Harley Race over to the WWF before the show, offering handsome Harley $250,000 to no-show Starrcade and bring the title with him. Race politely refused, and Ric Flair defeated him in a bloody main event cage match, bringing the 10 pounds of gold to Mid-Atlantic. Crockett followed Starrcade by strengthening working relationships with fellow NWA promoters, and a partnership with the AWA, CWG, and the CWA's Jerry Jarrett and Jerry Lawler looked to co-promote shows across the territories under the Pro Wrestling USA banner in mid-84, with the different promotions sharing talent in an effort to fight the WWF. Crockett was on a roll and was determined to show the rest of the NWA that he was the man to take McMahon down, and he was going to do it with his product. Though Jim Crockett faced resistance, he stuck to his guns, buying up smaller local territories to spread his influence, before buying out Ole Anderson's CWG and being elected NWA president for the second time in 1985. On the wrestling front, JCP's Mid-Atlantic was easily the most popular promotion in the NWA, with the likes of Ric Flair, Tully Blanchard, and Dusty Rhodes helping Crockett sell out show after show after show. To many, the NWA name was now interchangeable with that of JCP, as the top stars, angles, and matches all took place under Crockett's banner, and on his main show on WTBS, World Championship Wrestling. Taped from Turner Studios in Atlanta, the program was an undisputed rankings hit. So successful was World Championship Wrestling on WTBS that Crockett and head booker Dusty Rhodes launched the Great American Bash in 1985, with over 27,000 flocking to Charlotte's American Legion Memorial Stadium. Doubly impressive considering the plight many promoters were facing in the fight against the WWF. The Pro Wrestling USA experiment soon ran out of gas though, and despite big cards like Super Clash 85 occurring as part of this agreement, too many cooks spoiled the broth. David Crockett actively tried poaching AWA stars backstage at Super Clash, causing further splinters in the relationship between all involved. Then, after butting heads one too many times with Vern Gagne, Jim Crockett left the agreement in late 1985 to return to his plan of creating a true unified NWA with himself as the driving force. With his power and influence in the NWA nigh on untouchable, Crockett commissioned a new NWA World Heavyweight Championship belt for Ric Flair, but made sure the belt had no NWA branding, just in case it had to leave the watchful eye of the Alliance for any reason. In 1987, Crockett was elected NWA president for a third time, and as the biggest fish in the pond, there was little anyone else in the NWA could do to stop him enacting his will on the Alliance. Besides, if given the choice between Crockett or Vince, Crockett was the lesser of two evils from an NWA perspective. A relentless cross-country touring schedule saw Crockett achieve strong returns, with healthy gates across the board. Names such as the Road Warriors, the Rock and Roll Express, and the Four Horsemen were massive draws for the company, and with Texas's WCCW floundering after leaving the alliance and the AWA hurtling towards life support, the American wrestling scene was whittling down to Crockett versus McMahon. In this aggressive war of attrition, Crockett continued buying promotions, contracts, and syndicated TV slots, heading onwards towards his goal of heading up a singular NWA. In February 1987, Crockett would purchase Championship Wrestling from Florida, and 2 months later would also purchase Mid-South from Bill Watts, at the time called the UWF. Despite initial strong ratings on WTBS, Watts just couldn't keep up financially with Crockett and McMahon. After WWF took Watts' top stars such as Ted DiBiase and Jim Duggan, the UWF started to drown, exacerbated by the real-life Oklahoma oil recession adversely affecting his gate number. The WWF had strip-mined all the best talent from across America, with Watts' boys joining former Mid-Atlantic wrestlers such as Roddy Piper, Ricky Steamboat, and Greg Valentine in New York. Never mind the once-in-a-generation former AWA main eventer, Hulk Hogan. By buying out Watts in April 1987, Crockett now had TV coverage comparable to that of the WWF, and had fresh talent under his control, such as Rick Steiner, announcer Jim Ross, and a head-turning rookie known as Sting. Whilst the talent pool available to Crockett was enviable, he failed to successfully make many new main event level stars, nor had he adequately taken advantage of the stars Watt had already built, smugly having his stars dominate those from the UWF. The pieces were all there to do Mid-Atlantic versus UWF, but it never transpired and was seen as a massive missed opportunity. Crockett did try and push a new mega face in the form of Magnum TA, with legends saying Magnum was primed to become NWA World's Heavyweight Champion with victory over Ric Flair at Starrcade 86. Unfortunately, tragedy struck when Magnum suffered a career-ending car crash 1 month before Starrcade. And although Crockett and head booker Dusty pivoted Nikita Koloff into a babyface role to fill the void left by Magnum, they overwhelmingly stuck by their tried and true names. Predictably, fans got tired of the same old feuds and repetitive dusty finishes, as a sea of staleness washed over the product. After playing it safe and cautiously in the early 80s, Crockett was now desperate to compete with McMahon at any cost. Crockett rushed into buying up every promotion he could, and even invaded the territories of fellow NWA members, seriously pissing off what Alliance members were left. Whereas before it was us versus McMahon, it had become clear to those remaining that it was now us versus McMahon versus Crockett. Whilst TV viewing figures remained healthy, this rapid expansion soon got the better of Crockett. With JCP now a national brand, the costs of running markets all over the USA soon started piling up. Never mind the increased production costs and costs of keeping their syndicated TV slots. It was similar to the situation McMahon faced ahead of WrestleMania in 1985. And for JCP, the gates frankly weren't large enough to cover such expansion. Crockett now needed to physically be in several states all at once, as did his top stars, so he invested money in jets and limousines to help make travel more efficient and comfortable. Such lavish purchases and the limousine-riding, jet-flying lifestyle he and his top stars enjoyed ended up as a financial black hole. JCP was operating beyond its means, and the money woes quickly piled up. Even worse for Crockett, after the success of WrestleMania, the WWF had become absolutely massive. Such success meant that Vince McMahon had become even more of a bastard than before and wanted to crush the NWA for good, mainly because he could. First, McMahon counter-programmed Starrcade 87 with a new show called Survivor Series, with Vince threatening pay-per-view companies who wanted to air Starrcade by telling them if they chose the NWA over WWF, then they could kiss goodbye to future WWF shows, including WrestleMania. With 400,000 Survivor Series buyers against just 20,000 for Starrcade, the WWF had given Crockett a bloody nose, and McMahon knew he had his biggest competitor on the ropes. As a follow-up, McMahon then counter-programmed Crockett's Bunkhouse Stampede pay-per-view in January 1988 with a new event on cable called the Royal Rumble, and followed this days later with Hogan vs. Andre live on the main event on NBC, a show that garnered over 33 million viewers and remains to this day the largest rated unprecedented show in American televised wrestling history. Whilst the WWF's tactics dealt major blows to business, Crockett's booking of Starrcade 87 and Bunkhouse Stampede in non-traditional NWA markets such as New York and Chicago were a self-inflicted wound. These shows did not pay off financially, alienated the hardcore fanbase who were miffed that the biggest shows of the year weren't on their doorstep, and were the latest in a long list of professional woes for the company. JCP continued to put out well-received cards, and enthusiasm remained for the product thanks to the efforts of shows such as Clash of the Champions, but the WWF had simply gotten too big to compete with. JCP's luck had finally ran out. Facing bankruptcy, Jim Crockett Jr. needed someone to buy his wrestling empire from him and continue the fight against the WWF. Surely, it would be too much of a tall order to find a wealthy businessman who not only knew and respected wrestling, but could also negotiate broadcast deals, bankroll production, and had enough of an ego to go against Vince McMahon head-on. Luckily for Crockett, Ted Turner not only ticked all those boxes, but he also hadn't forgotten about Black Saturday. After months of legal wrangling and intense negotiations, Ted Turner officially became the owner of Jim Crockett's wrestling empire in November 1988. With the sale, rumored to have been around a cool $9 million, Jim Crockett Promotions were officially declared dead, and in its place stood the Universal Wrestling Corporation. Crockett remained with the company as vice president in an advisory role, whilst retaining a minority interest, as did brother David, whilst Dusty Rhodes remained head booker. Yet no matter the name and personnel involved, the UWC was Ted Turner's property and was but a small cog in his media empire. The deal should have come as little surprise. Turner and Crockett had enjoyed a healthy working relationship ever since Crockett bought out Vince McMahon's WTBS slot, and Turner would go on to help JCP on the home video and pay-per-view front in the late 80s, with the two sides agreeing a new TV deal before Crockett put the family silver up for sale. 3 years earlier, in 1985, rumors swirled suggesting Ted Turner was looking to buy into JCP then. Confusion arose in some parts as to what Turner had actually purchased, with some believing that Ted had bought the NWA outright. To help clear things up, the UWC was soon formally renamed World Championship Wrestling, with the company keeping its ties with the NWA for promotional and audience recognition reasons, as well as for its sense of lineage. Whilst Turner was keen on shaking up the wrestling business, he didn't want to risk alienating his core audience, as he knew firsthand how wrestling fans cared little for change. The final days of JCP were marred by severe mismanagement, despite their best intentions, with the finances an utter shambles. With McMahon breathing down his neck, Crockett had taken out several large loans to stave off bankruptcy. Bill Watts was still owed money by Crockett from the UWF sale, never mind the other huge debts the company had racked up. On TV and in arenas, JCP seemed very healthy despite the backstage turmoil, and those in the industry pointed the finger of blame squarely at the Crocketts and Dusty Rhodes for frittering away what they had built. That was all wiped clean with Turner's buyout. Whilst Crockett had done admirably in his battles against McMahon, with Turner at the helm, WCW had deeper pockets and more resources than the WWF. If this was indeed a war, then going from Crockett to Turner was like upgrading from a rifle to a nuke. Wanting to engage in some friendly banter, legend says that Turner personally called Vince McMahon to announce he was now in the wrestling business, whereas McMahon smugly informed Turner that he himself was in the entertainment business. WCW was never intended to be another regional wrestling territory. It was time to go one better than Crockett and truly go national, international even. This was no longer a wrestling company either. It was now a corporate media property and was going to be run as such, which in turn caused a whole mess of problems. Weeks after the buyout, Dusty Rhodes was fired from the company. The corporate family-friendly facing TBS didn't want bloodshed in their WCW and were naturally outraged when Rhodes went against orders and booked an angle leading up to Starrcade 88 that saw the American Dream pissing blood out of his face after being stabbed in the eye with a spike by the Road Warriors. Proud NWA pillar Dusty Rhodes was out the door and into the waiting arms of Vince McMahon. With head booker Dusty gone, WCW's booking was instead handled by George Scott, who in turn was fired and replaced by a committee that featured the likes of Ric Flair and Kevin Sullivan. This is a carousel that would keep on turning for several years and would lead to several disjointed and easily defined eras of WCW creative. Even more controversial was the decision to install former TV station manager and Pizza Hut executive Jim Herd as WCW executive vice president. Herd knew next to nothing about the pro wrestling business, and that's being kind. Herd had seen the family-friendly style the WWF were making bucket loads of cash with and thought it best WCW follow suit. Music to the corporate ears, I'm sure. For example, Herd suggested the gimmick of a tag team of hunchbacks with the idea that both their shoulders couldn't be pinned to the mat. Herd also introduced the Ding Dongs and Big Josh to the world, the latter complete with actual bears coming down to the ring with him. Ole Anderson found himself as head booker in 1990 and fully leaned into the wrestle bollocks side of things, bringing in such grappling luminaries as RoboCop and the Black Scorpion, absolute classics of the genre. Few others were completely on board with this tonal shift though, not least the Black Scorpion himself, Ric Flair. Flair and Herd clashed over many issues, such as Flair's ousting as head booker in early 1990 and subsequent disagreements with returning Dusty Rhodes. Never mind the fact that Herd thought Flair was so passé, so suggested he accept a massive pay cut, shave his head, wear a diamond earring and change his name to Spartacus. Flair lightly told Herd where to go using very strong language and was fired in the summer of 1991. There was just one tiny problem with this though, as Nate was not only WCW's biggest draw, but was the reigning NWA WCW World Heavyweight Champion at the time of his dismissal. Although Herd stripped Flair of the WCW Championship, the NWA still recognized Flair as champ, and Flair was owed $25,000 due to paying a deposit on the physical title belt. This was an old NWA clause that meant you wouldn't throw the strap into a bin in a rival promotion or you'd lose your sweet dollar. The ball had landed in Flair's court, so he took it and hightailed it to the WWF with Big Goldie firmly around his waist. WCW eventually got the title back after exerting some legal pressure against the WWF and gave Flair what monies were owed. But the damage was already done. The WWF had tried landing Flair in 1988, but Flair's involvement was key to Turner buying JCP. Now, Vince McMahon had his competitor's biggest star and was set to insert him into his main event. Fans were pissed off beyond recognition, with loud "We want Flair" chants heard at WCW shows around the country, with poor Lex Luger looking embarrassed at the terrible Great American Bash 91 show as he won an ugly stand-in world championship over Barry Windham to a wave of fan apathy. Unsurprisingly, Herd left his position in early 92 and WCW would bounce from EVP to EVP. After Kip Fry had a cup of coffee in the big seat, things somehow became even messier when Cowboy Bill Watts took over in mid-92. Watts tried to 180 away from Oz and the Chamber of Horrors and all that other insanity, instituting a no-nonsense old-school wrestling mentality complete with legit fines for throwing wrestlers over the top rope, no fraternizations between the faces and the heels, and a banning of top turnbuckle aerial maneuvers. A move that obviously went down well with WCW's up-and-coming cruiserweight wrestlers. Pay was slashed across the board, cheap old-timers were brought in as hungry young stars like Brian Pillman and Scotty Flamingo fought for a spot on the card, whilst Watts brought in and pushed his son Eric to the delight of precisely no one. Watts' policies were unpopular and his vision boring, but he did manage to bring Ric Flair back to the company and had Turner opening up the checkbook to make big money moves for Sid Vicious, Davey Boy Smith, and Big Van Vader. The negatives of Watts' time in charge far outweighed the positives. His tenure wouldn't last long, as he was fired in 1993 after past racially insensitive comments were brought to influential Turner executive and MLB legend Hank Aaron, with allegations of anti-Semitism also leveled at the Cowboy by the likes of Paulie Dangerously. Remember, this all happened as the pro wrestling boom had all but cooled off in the USA. WCW's business had been unremarkable for a few years due to half-assed booking and a lack of clear identity identity, and it was now stagnating worse than before. Clearly, the company was in turmoil. Seemingly every Turner executive not named Ted Turner despised WCW as it was a money loser, was unattractive to advertisers, and was seen as decidedly lowbrow compared to other company properties. All accounts suggest these execs were praying WCW would get canned and taken off the table. But as long as Ted Turner was in charge of the company, WCW would be safe. If they were to prove the naysayers wrong, WCW needed a fresh face to shake things up and streamline the business. Whilst the smart money was either on Jim Ross or Tony Schiavone taken over from Watts, it was ultimately another WCW announcer who would take the reins instead. Although the appointment would shock everyone in the company and would ultimately take professional wrestling to unparalleled heights. World Championship Wrestling was now in the hands of Eric Bischoff. Hired as a C-show level announcer, Eric Bischoff had only joined WCW in 1991, but by February of 1993, he found himself as executive producer of WCW television, working alongside Ole Anderson as head booker and department heads for pay-per-view and syndication, with all four execs reporting to Bill Shaw and Bob Jew. A lifelong hustler, natural-born salesman, and noted karate enthusiast, Bischoff got his start in the business with the AWA, working in the office for Vern Gagne before falling into an on-screen position. When the AWA's fortunes reached the point of no return, Bischoff unsuccessfully auditioned for a WWF announcing role in 1990 before finding himself in WCW a year later. The fact that Bischoff managed to end up in the hot seat was a surprise to many, especially Jim Ross, with good old JR exiting WCW shortly after Bischoff's appointment and making his way to the WWF. Bischoff would later state that JR's closeness to Bill Watts didn't do him any favors when seeking the top spot in WCW. Bischoff soon set about streamlining WCW in order to make it a must-see product, driven by a desire to turn a profit. He approached the challenge from a TV production perspective rather than an out-and-out wrestling perspective. Bischoff was about as far removed from old-school veterans like Dusty Rhodes and Bill Watts as you could be. His Hollywood smile and effective tiptoeing of the corporate line marking him as one to watch within Turner. But he was also no pencil pusher, preferring cowboy boots and a Harley to a pinstripe suit and a briefcase. One move Bischoff made was to bulk tape WCW TV months in advance in an effort to save money and to edit crowd reactions. But with this came the logistical headache of keeping on top of who was champion and when. Scenarios could and did exist where a wrestler could lose their title at a TV taping before they'd even technically won it. This didn't sit well with the NWA, whose titles WCW was still using, and led to a massive fallout between the two entities. I'll sum this up as succinctly as I can because frankly, it's a confusing mess. So by 1993, WCW felt they'd outgrown the now largely irrelevant NWA, and were the last big promotion standing in the alliance. Although they still used NWA titles, WCW booked the champs how they would have liked, rather than with the go-ahead from the NWA board, and didn't send the champs to wrestle for the other NWA affiliates. The NWA said WCW couldn't do this and attempted to sue them for a breach of contract. During advanced TV tapings, WCW made Rick Rude world champion against Alliance wishes. But didn't really, but kinda did, as Rude had Big Goldie, but it was renamed the WCW International Heavyweight Championship as WCW fell out with the NWA and left the Alliance, so could no longer use the NWA name for the NWA belt that they were in possession of. Yeah. New Japan got involved with Hiroshi Hase holding Big Goldie for a bit, but there was also a separate WCW World Championship that was held by Vader, who dropped it to Ric Flair, who later unified the title with Big Goldie and reigned as undisputed WCW World Heavyweight Champion. On the business side, WCW was slowly creeping in the right direction. Brutal scissor fight between Arn Anderson and Sid Vicious in a UK hotel aside. And after being officially appointed Senior Vice President in 1994, Bischoff made the most important deal of his career when he signed the immortal Hulk Hogan to a WCW contract. Despite it being a year since his last televised WWF match, and over 10 years since the start of Hulkamania, to the average Joe and advertisers the world over, Hogan was still the embodiment of professional wrestling. And his seal of approval elevated WCW to a new level. To those outside the wrestling bubble, WCW was now on the map, and it was time to push fully into the mainstream. The checkbook remained open, with Hogan soon joined by fellow megastar Randy Savage, both complimenting the earlier signings of household names Bobby the Brain Heenan and Mean Gene Okerlund. Then it got a bit ridiculous. Soon, WCW was signing seemingly any name from WWF's glory heirs, no matter how little they added to the product. Brutus Beefcake, Earthquake, The Big Boss Man, Jim Duggan, the latter of whom squashed US champion Steve Austin in his WCW pay-per-view debut. Mr. T even had a match on a WCW pay-per-view. Basically, if you were old mates with Hogan, then you were guaranteed an overinflated WCW wage. Whilst homegrown stars like Austin and Cactus Jack slipped down the card and were soon out the door. Even with the new avenues these big signings opened for WCW and a refreshed and renewed working relationship with the internationally white-hot New Japan Pro Wrestling, business still wasn't stellar and WCW remained in the red. WCW was a money loser since day one, and despite vastly reducing the deficit, Bischoff couldn't get the ball over the line. Speaking of that partnership with New Japan, WCW found themselves part of the largest shows in wrestling history in April of 1995, when Maverick New Japan head Antonio Inoki booked a pair of shows in Pyongyang, North Korea in order to spread a message of peace to the isolated dictator-led state. Over 300,000 people flocked to the shows. Whether they were forced to is another conversation altogether, and saw Ric Flair battle Inoki in a headline bout on night 2. But in the States, no one really cared. Domestically, Hogan and Co. brought pay-per-view and gate numbers up, yet it still wasn't enough to get WCW cooking. Ted Turner wanted to know just how WCW could compete with the WWF, and hopefully make some money. Bischoff knew the answer was simple, but not wholly realistic. WCW needed primetime TV. Surprisingly, Turner not only agreed, but he sanctioned a live show to run directly against WWF's flagship, Monday Night Raw. And on September the 4th, 1995, WCW Monday Nitro Live debuted on TNT. The Monday Night Wars had begun. With the first episode broadcast live from the Mall of America, Nitro was loud, bright, and very expensive looking. It showcased everyone from Hulk Hogan, Sting, and Ric Flair to Brian Pillman and Jushin Thunder Liger, with a big middle finger to the competition in the form of a returning Lex Luger. After 3 years of working for New York, Luger jumped ship from WWF back to WCW after Sting told Bischoff that Lex was working on a handshake deal with Vince McMahon and wanted out of the WWF. As far as opening shots in a war go, this was a big one. Wrestling was still mired in the early 90s doldrums though, and it took a while for Nitro to really get going. Bischoff, fueled by a desire to prove Turner execs wrong, Turner profit, and beat the WWF into extinction, resorted to every dirty trick in the book to keep his audience watching WCW rather than flicking over to Raw. Rumor mongering, leaked results, and just downright insulting the WWF were the norm on Nitro, with lead announcer, yes, Eric Bischoff, loudly rallying against his biggest rival. Vince McMahon was clearly feeling the squeeze as he launched several defensive and offensive countermeasures of his own, from claiming that big bad Ted Turner was trying to drive the little mom and pop shop WWF out of business, a line that likely caused Vern Gagne, Jim Crockett, Ole Anderson et al. To rupture a kidney from laughing so hard, to threatening legal action, attacking Turner in the press, and airing parody sketches, poking fun at Turner and his unscrupulous decrepit stars, The Huckster, Nacho Man, and Scheme Gene, as part of billionaire Ted's Wrestling War Room. The fight was really McMahon versus Bischoff, but by making it look like McMahon versus Turner, the WWF wanted to portray themselves as the scrappy underdog, punching up against this tyrannical billionaire. Turner himself was focused on his fight with fellow media mogul Rupert Murdoch, with Murdoch's impending Fox News channel emerging as a direct rival to Turner's beloved CNN. Things were threatening to get nastier than Crockett versus McMahon ever got, but it led to both companies pulling out every stop to raise their game. For WCW and head booker Kevin Sullivan, this saw a gradual shift away from the hokey bollocks like the Sullivan-led Dungeon of Doom to stories more grounded in reality like the loose cannon Brian Pillman and Flair versus Savage. While some of the best wrestlers in in the world like Chris Benoit, Dean Malenko, and Eddie Guerrero were given an opportunity to show what they could do in the ring. Like I said, it was a gradual shift. We still had to deal with the Giant being thrown off a building after a monster truck sumo battle and miraculously surviving. These initial successes in the Monday Night Wars allowed ATM Eric to keep the checkbook open, and in early '96 he changed the wrestling business forever with a pair of seismic signings. You want to go to war? You want a war? You're gonna get one. Starting with the May 27th, 1996 edition, Nitro was now a 2-hour live affair, with the previous 8-month run successful enough to warrant a second hour, with Raw remaining a 1-hour show over on USA Network. During the second match of the night, the man previously known as former WWF Intercontinental Champion Razor Ramon hopped the guardrail and announced he'd arrived in WCW to start a war. Several weeks later, he was joined by the man previously known as former WWF champion Diesel, and the two now unnamed wrestlers insinuated that they were invading from the WWF and would be bringing a third man to join them in their hostile takeover of WCW. Both men were in fact full employees of WCW, but access to backstage deals and gossip was far harder to come by than it is today, with only a tiny fraction of wrestling fans being fully clued into the behind-the-scenes info of the business. For the average WCW viewer, they were seeing what they believed to be WWF contracted stars invading Nitro. For WWF fans, they were no doubt curious of the rumors of these conquering heroes invading the competition, and were soon flicking between Raw and Nitro to see what was going on. WWF filed a lawsuit immediately, and the idea that Razor and Diesel were invading from New York was quickly dropped, with the two men admitting on the air at the Great American Bash that they were not employed by the WWF. But the seeds were planted and interest was simmering as these two giants wreaked havoc and destruction week by week. Everyone wondered just who this third man would be, and at Bash at the Beach '96 they'd find out when the outsiders Scott Hall and Kevin Nash and their mystery partner would take on the heroic Sting, Lex Luger and Randy Savage. At the pay-per-view, Hall and Nash went it alone against 3 men, but soon evened the playing field when Luger was taken out of the equation with injury. When the remaining 4 men went down after an extended outsiders beatdown on Sting, Hulk Hogan returned after a 4-month absence to a hero's welcome to make the save, before doing the unthinkable and hitting his former Mega Powers partner with a series of leg drops. Hogan was the third man. Brother. After a 16-year face run that saw him become a hero to millions worldwide, Hulk Hogan had turned heel. Fans pelted the ring with garbage. Hogan took the mic and said the crap in the ring represented the fans and proclaimed the new group the New World Order. In WCW, Hogan's say your prayers, take your vitamins shtick had gotten staler than 6-week-old bread. And after a series of diminishing returns and increased boos from the WCW crowd, it looked like the 42-year-old Hulkster was going to permanently leave WCW for Hollywood. However, Hogan leaned into the apathy, turned his back on the fans, albeit after a lot of convincing from Bischoff and Kevin Sullivan, and a different kind of Hollywood was now Hogan's destiny. And with it, Eric Bischoff had found a license to print money. The idea of a heel Hogan was fresh and was an unthinkable prospect to a whole generation of fans. Nitro was already seen as unpredictable due to airing in a 2-hour live slot compared to Raw mainly airing as a 1-hour pre-taped affair. And this new heel crew upped the ante significantly with an extra unopposed hour of Nitro, allowing more time for the NWO to cause untold havoc. The NWO was Bischoff's masterstroke and was similar to an idea that had done gangbusters for New Japan Pro Wrestling for their inter-promotional war against the UWFI in 1995. It was exactly the type of angle that many believe Jim Crockett should have run when he bought out the Watts a decade earlier. The NWO soon bolstered its ranks with the Giants joining the fray, whilst former WWF stars Ted DiBiase and the 1-2-3 Kid would soon jump ship, the latter renamed Six, and the crew would change the business, airing paid ads in grainy black and white, smashing the absolute bollocks off their peers with baseball bats, and spray painting everything in sight, including the big gold belt. This was unlike anything mainstream American wrestling had ever seen, and it was legitimately cool. Bischoff handled the major beats of the NWO NWO story, whilst head booker Sullivan used his masterful heat-drawn techniques to keep the bad guys very bad indeed, and the fans, they could not get enough. It didn't take long for WCW to start reaping the benefits of the NWO. In the TV ratings, Nitro pushed Raw firmly into the number 2 spot, and was fast becoming the show to watch, with the undercard cruiserweight division presenting something that American audience had seldom seen before, whilst the drama of the NWO battling against WCW's home guard was genuinely must-see stuff. And let's not forget those merch sales. Boy howdy. Such was WCW's growing power that they turned the tables on Vince McMahon, with McMahon scrambling to offer top draw Bret Hart a massive 20-year contract just to keep WCW at bay, despite not knowing if he had the financial clout to honour such a deal. While the NWO was drawing in viewers on TV and fans to the arenas, for them, or indeed any dominant heel faction to thrive, they needed a valiant babyface to oppose them. And WCW had one of the most beloved babyfaces of all time in their corner to fight their battles. The man called Sting. Sting was WCW's golden boy, and in hindsight was the most important acquisition from Crockett buying out Watts in '87. The people loved him, but rather than continuing with the neon and peroxide grinning surfer babyface trope of the 80s and early 90s, WCW decided to turn Sting into a morose, vengeful spirit, hanging out in the rafters and observing every move the NWO made. Sting's cynical misanthropy and the NWO's sarcastically charged anarchy perfectly tapped into the aggressive zeitgeist of the post-Kurt Cobain mid-1990s. In kayfabe, Sting felt betrayed by accusations of disloyalty from the WCW locker room, so isolated himself and started dressing like indie comic book character The Crow, a Scott Hall suggestion according to legend. With baseball bat in hand, he would descend from the rafters to beat the absolute piss out of the NWO to obscene pops as Nitro would crash off the air with Tony Schiavone promising to see us the following Monday. This new version of Sting was a make-or-break gamble for WCW, with the decision made to keep him out of the ring for a year and have him not utter a single word. To say it paid off is an understatement. In fact, it's arguable that Sting's transformation was almost as game-changing as Hogan's. Doubly so when you realise that Sting was penciled in to be the third man of the NWO if the Hulkster backed out. After several years of mixed fortunes, pro wrestling was once again thrust into the forefront of entertainment. But this time, WCW versus the NWO led the way. Nitro was a sellout week after week, merch was flying off the stands, and ratings were going through the roof. Pro wrestling was booming once more. Even the previously anti-wrestling executives in Turner were now on board, with some eager to get tickets to the hottest live show in town. WWF also grew in popularity during this time period, but despite holding stronger brand awareness with the public, they just couldn't catch up to WCW in seemingly every other metric. WCW had the bigger names, the bigger budget, and the greater mainstream appeal, a far cry from the efforts of Crockett & Co. And there were genuine fears that the WWF could go the way of so many of Vince's rivals from the 80s. Such was the financial toll of this latest war. As Starrcade 97 came onto the horizon, WCW geared up for the biggest match in their history: Hollywood Hogan versus Sting for the world title, the culmination of the biggest ever storyline in professional wrestling, pitting the last hope of WCW against the head of the most dominant heel force in wrestling history. It was a match that had been built for 18 months and led to WCW's biggest ever pay-per-view buy rate. Anticipation was at fever pitch. Starrcade was a can't-miss affair, an open goal, and it all went tits up. Behind the scenes, Hogan's ego was spiraling out of control, with the Hulkster's contract containing a creative control clause, meaning that Hogan had a final say on how his angles would play out, and whether he'd even do the job. Brother. As for Sting, his private life was apparently a mess, with claims of infidelity and substance abuse following the stinger. Hogan and Bischoff were concerned. Still, it was business as usual at Starrcade. Both parties just had to follow the plan. Hogan would pin Sting after a leg drop, crooked former NWO referee Nick Patrick would do a fast count, and newly hired former WWF champion Bret Hart would march down fresh off the Montreal screwjob and would make sure the match had ended fairly, with Sting ultimately winning the title. However, Patrick did not fast count. He counted normally. Sting was soundly defeated after one solitary leg drop, and the air left the arena. Hart still came out to restart the match, and despite a distinct lack of shenanigans, Sting came out on top and the crowd exploded. But still, looking back, this was a serious own goal. The hottest angle of a generation ballsed up at the finish line due to someone convincing Patrick to count normally. Then, to make matters worse, 10 days later on TV, Sting was stripped of the title due to the post-match messiness. And it was a massive FU to all the fans who had been invested for the past year and a half. Never mind the fact you had hottest free agent in wrestling history, Bret bastarding Hart in the company, just hanging around rather than being effectively built into the main event scene. Couple all this with an underwhelming card that featured Bischoff versus Larry Zbyszko and a Kevin Nash no-show, and Starrcade was a creative disaster. It wasn't just Hogan who was being difficult either, as the backstage influence of Hall and Nash was also growing out of control. Like Hogan, Hall and Nash seemingly did whatever they pleased in WCW, whether it was antagonizing their peers, brawling with veterans like Roddy Piper in the locker room, and allegedly even locking Bischoff in a cupboard when he fired their best mate Six via FedEx in '98. The Outsiders were untouchable. They were getting paid an obscene amount of cash. They could sell 1,000 t-shirts by just saying, "Hey yo." And half the time, it seemed like they just couldn't be arsed performing. Why did they have to? They had more money and power than they could ever have dreamed of. There were few incentives for them anymore, especially as they started getting more involved in booking affairs. The inmates were starting to take over the asylum, and there were next to no repercussions. Despite all of this, WCW remained white hot heading into 1998, and whilst the dropping of the ball at Starrcade was seen at the time as a mere blip, in hindsight it was a significant indication of how things would pan out moving forward. Bischoff likely didn't care, as after years of being the black sheep of Turner's empire, WCW was now a golden goose, bringing in over $112 million in 1997, then a gross of over $188 million reported in 1998. 97's profit allegedly wiped out all of the losses the company had made since Turner's purchase in 1988. In terms of roster, WCW had one of the most stacked in wrestling history, with main eventers Hollywood Hogan, Randy Savage, Sting, Lex Luger, Roddy Piper, and Ric Flair. A tag division that included the Outsiders, Harlem Heat, and the Steiners. A mid-card featuring Bret Hart, Chris Benoit, Raven, and Diamond Dallas Page. That cruiserweight division with Rey Mysterio Jr., Dean Malenko, Chris Jericho, Eddie Guerrero, and co. Never mind Chicago Bulls bad boy Dennis Rodman turning up to dish out a slapping on behalf of the NWO from time to time. It was an embarrassment of riches. WCW were cruising, but unbeknownst to them, they were cruising towards disaster. Nitro's successes were not lost on everyone at Turner, and now the Time Warner owned TNT. And in January 1998, the show would move to 3 hours every Monday. What's more, a second 2-hour primetime show was launched on Thursdays on TBS the very same month, despite Eric Bischoff's protestations. That show was WCW Thunder. Within the space of several weeks, Eric Bischoff went from overseeing 2 hours of live wrestling a week to 5 hours, plus shows like WCW Saturday Night, various syndicated WCW programming, and don't forget all of those important pay-per-views, all 12 of them. Time Warner were on a hiring freeze at the time, so Bischoff could not bring in additional staff to help with Thunder, nor could he receive additional funding. Bischoff was also taking a slightly closer eye on booking concerns as Kevin Sullivan dropped in and out of the hot seat. He was working his on-screen talent and storyline as the smarmy evil head of the NWO, as well as in the commentary booth, and he was now the acting WCW president. Safe to say, Eric and his team were starting to get stretched very thinly, and they could see the WWF gaining in the rearview mirror. The WWF had an organically grown megastar leading their fight back against WCW, a profane, beer-swilling ass kicker by the name of Stone Cold Steve Austin. The same Steve Austin who jobbed to hacksaw Jim Duggan in seconds in WCW. The same Steve Austin who was fired via FedEx by Eric Bischoff in 1995. Vince McMahon was positioned positioning Austin to finally win the WWF Championship from Shawn Michaels at WrestleMania 14 in March of 1998, and enlisted baddest man on the planet Mike Tyson to act as the enforcer for the match. Bischoff himself would later say that Tyson's debut on Raw is War was the moment he realized that momentum was shifting in the WWF's favor, with Sullivan and Kevin Nash saying similar. Add to this Six defecting to D-Generation X from the NWO, and the WWF were truly embracing their attitude. Come April, and Raw is War ended Nitro's 83-week streak on top of the wrestling ratings battle. But Nitro was still very much in the fight. The two shows would take turns occupying the #1 spot for the remainder of the year. But it was clear that WCW was not as bulletproof as they had seemed in 1997. The edgier, more profane WWF were not going away, with Vince McMahon himself transformed into an on-screen supervillain after the Montreal Screwjob. WCW had done the evil boss angle first with Bischoff, and Eric used his platform to call out McMahon so he could kick him repeatedly in the neck on pay-per-view. McMahon declined this invitation. On screen, the NWO, while still an undeniable cash cow, was now bloated and convoluted, and fans started to get frustrated at seeing the same thing week in and week out. A seemingly non-stop parade of DQs, interferences, and schmozzes, with very few matches or angles ending in a satisfactory manner. Bischoff, at one point, intended for the NWO to have their own show separate from WCW, but the unpopular sold-out 97 pay-per-view seemingly put paid to that. This didn't stop all pay-per-views being co-branded WCW NWO affairs though, such was the rebel group's drawing power. Backstage, WCW was starting to book week by week in order to keep fans guessing and to avoid spoilers being leaked by the dirt sheets, anxious to keep any advantage over the resurgent WWF. More worryingly, Nash and Hogan were clashing frequently. Hall's private life had become a real point of concern after being milked for some storyline dollar, and Ric Flair disappeared from the company after spectacularly falling out with Bischoff. Compared to the pre-planned and roadmap WWF, WCW was a frantic mess. The decision to split the NWO into opposing Hollywood and Wolfpack factions did freshen things up a little, but it was still the same faces and the BS shenanigans in the main event scene, as the dreaded glass ceiling above the mid-card and cruiserweights became triple glazed. An age-old stick used to beat WCW with was that they relied too much on former WWF stars. This was a tiny bit unfair, as every major wrestling promotion in history was full of stars made elsewhere. It's how Vince McMahon took over the wrestling world in the 1980s. But there was admittedly more than a grain of truth to it with WCW. Whilst WCW did have non-WWF talent by the bucket load, they were seldom positioned as well on the card as the bigger names, a move that would ultimately cost them. Whilst the early days of Nitro were bolstered by Hogan, Savage, and the other more recognizable faces from wrestling's recent past, WWF had no choice but to stick with its new generation, and used this opportunity to positively build new stars, including several WCW cast-offs. Handily for WCW, they inadvertently struck gold in late 97 with a 6'3" rookie monster, sending him to their power plant training facility for seasoning, before organically turning him into one of the biggest stars of the entire industry with a simple but effective push through 1998. Enter the man, Goldberg. Say what you want about Goldberg in the 2020s, but in 1998 he was truly a force of nature. A man of few words with an epic entrance, an intense moveset, and an exaggerated winning streak. Fans rallied behind Goldberg as he literally ran through everyone in his path, taking the US Championship with him for the ride. One of the few homegrown success stories of WCW, Goldberg's rise culminated with a World Championship win over Hollywood Hogan in front of over 41,000 fans in the Georgia Dome in July of 1998. This was on an episode of Nitro as well, a frankly insane crowd for weekly television. Logic says they should have been saved for a pay-per-view main event, but WCW coveted that #1 spot on TV and struck whilst the iron was hot. With WWF starting to pull ahead, WCW fought back by regularly promoting huge matches on free weekly television, like an insanely star-powered tag match on Nitro pitting Hogan and Bret Hart against Sting and the Ultimate Warrior. But in October 98, WCW would win the Monday Night Ratings battle for the final time. The WWF had an incredible 1998, punctuated by the Austin vs. McMahon feud and the rise of The Rock, and by the end of the year, they were posing astronomical numbers on TV and pay-per-view. Despite this, and despite his shortcomings in the ring, Goldberg as champion was a massive draw for WCW. Fans flocked to see Big Bill batter bastards, and his match against Diamond Dallas Page at Halloween Havoc 98 proved that with the right opponent, he could look really, really good. Although in some markets, the pay-per-view feed ended before Goldberg vs DDP aired, forcing WCW to show the match for free the next night on Nitro and issue millions in refunds for those who bought the pay-per-view for the main event. Oh, and the Ultimate Warrior and Hogan had one of the worst matches ever just to satisfy Hollywood's immense ego. No show quite sums up WCW's misfortunes better than Halloween Havoc 1998. Whilst financially business may have been better than ever in 1998, creatively WCW was running dry. Goldberg was fresh, but he was one-dimensional. The NWO was long in the tooth. Hogan left the company to run for president. Sting was out for several months to sort his personal problems. Thunder had become an afterthought almost instantaneously. And there was a lot of nonsensical dross playing out on TV. I mean, does anyone really know what Bret Hart did in 1998 apart from look sad? The decision was made to place Kevin Nash and DDP into a creative team with Dusty Rhodes and Kevin Sullivan to freshen things up, with Bischoff having a final say over the major angles. However, all accounts suggest this team was really just the Kevin Nash show. This was evident when Nash was booked to be the one to end Goldberg's streak and win the world title for the first time at Starrcade 98 with the help of Scott Hall and a cattle prod. Granted, Nash was super over and him as champion wasn't a bad idea, but after the initial pop wore off, this decision was seen as the wrong one. Fans wanted to see if Goldberg could be beaten, but not like this. While Sullivan was reportedly one of the loudest dissenting voices in the back, angered over the convoluted mess of the angle. Nash still disavows this being his idea, saying if he did book it, he would have beaten Goldberg clean with one move, not with 1,000 run-ins and gimmicks. Regardless, this was now 2 years on the spin that Starrcade would end with a creative misstep, with an ever-growing section of the fan base frustrated and incensed by WCW's booking. As 1999 came into view, things would only get worse. January the 4th, 1999, WCW Monday Nitro. Kevin Nash was set to put his newly won world title on the line against Goldberg in a rematch from Starrcade. But in storyline, Goldberg was arrested on the night. Without an opponent, a returning Hollywood Hogan stepped up to take on Nash. A first-time singles clash between the two former NWO allies. WCW needed to make up ground on the WWF in the ratings, so pushed this massive match on free TV rather than pay-per-view, with a packed Georgia Dome once again playing host. The live audience were at fever pitch for this upcoming clash of titans. As the bell rang, Nash flexed and preened, only for Hogan to meekly poke him in the chest. Big Sexy then theatrically bumped, and handed the Hulkster the win in less than 1 minute, in the process reuniting the NWO with Scott Steiner, Scott Hall, Lex Luger, and Buff Bagwell as the 6 men beat down and now free Goldberg. The finger poke of doom. Yet another BS finish. The belt reduced to mockery, Goldberg's streak rendered meaningless, never mind Nash's Starrcade win, an exciting potential Wolfpack Nash versus NWO Hollywood Hogan feud quashed, zero satisfaction for fans, and now a 45-year-old Hogan with the title once more. Nash would claim the plan was to reunite the NWO as a fearsome group of heels for Goldberg to run through on his way back to the top, but this never happened. This was an unmitigated disaster all round, and the viewers were starting to get fed up. Things went from bad to worse, as earlier in the night Tony Schiavone, under instruction from Eric Bischoff, leaked that former WCW talent Mick Foley would win the WWF Championship for the first time from The Rock on a pre-taped Raw is War. Rather than make fans at home scoff in pity, more than 600,000 viewers changed channel to see Foley triumph. Whilst 2.1 million would tune in for Goldberg's return at the end of the night, they were treated to the finger poke. This terrible Nitro main event was a self-inflicted gut shot, a slow-release wound that WCW would never recover from. Despite this, the Monday Night Wars were still very much alive in early 1999, with over 10 million people tuning into Raw and Nitro every week. WCW was still posting healthy TV numbers and a succession of million-dollar gates. But as the year went on, numbers started to drop and drop and drop. WCW would double down by pushing the same old faces once more, with Ric Flair back in the main event scene after a controversial fake heart attack angle in 1998. Randy Savage back in the mix via an infamously bad storyline with a white Hummer, whilst the returning Sid Vicious would also make his way to the top of the pile. The discontent in the mid-card became exacerbated as WCW continued to neglect pushing new faces to the top, presumably reaching fever pitch when the Outsiders unmasked Rey Mysterio Jr. seemingly for the hell of it. Although DDP was finally crowned champ at Spring Stampede 99, it was arguably too late, as he, like WCW, was not as hot as he had been a year prior. Homegrown former world champion The Giant left WCW in February of 1999 and joined the WWF as The Big Show, whilst the super popular former Cruiserweight champion Chris Jericho would arrive on WWF TV in the summer, debuting in a segment with The Rock after being brushed off by Goldberg in WCW. And you can bet that WCW's disgruntled stars saw how well their former colleagues were being treated in New York. Sensing tension and unease amongst his wrestlers, Bischoff held a town hall meeting in the summer of '99 and told his roster that anyone who was unhappy in WCW could receive their release if they wanted it, on the proviso they couldn't instantly sign with the WWF. Only one person took Eric up on his offer, with former WCW US champion Raven leaving the company and heading back to ECW. WCW ploughed on, constantly hoping to claw that #1 spot back by any means, going as far as to produce several expensive cross-promotional stunts with the likes of Megadeth, Master P and Kiss in 1999. Whilst past angles with mainstream stars like Dennis Rodman, Karl Malone and even Jay Leno had worked in spades in 1998, these ones, well, they all fell flat on their arse. Come autumn of 1999, and WCW was now reportedly losing between $1.5 to $5 million a month, where just a year earlier they were making around $500,000 per day. An expensive rebrand earlier in the year failed to restore the buzz. Talent morale was in the toilet, and seemingly no one had any clue what to do next. Overworked, making poor decisions, and losing a ton of money for the company, Eric Bischoff was relieved of his duties as WCW president by Turner Sports head Dr. Harvey Schiller in September of 1999, with Bischoff later revealing that he was on the verge of walking out anyway. Eazy-E had grown disillusioned in late 1998 when Time Warner executives started meddling with WCW's affairs, telling Bischoff how to run a show and wanted to make the product more family friendly. This is despite the fact WCW reached record heights by pushing the envelope, which led to WWF following suit and abandoning TV PG in 1997, a move that made them one of the hottest properties on TV. Further alleged meddling from the suit saw a potential deal to air WCW specials on the huge NBC fall by the wayside, and Bischoff had reached the end of his tether. With Bischoff's exit, the position of WCW president was abolished. In his absence, newly promoted EVP Bill Bush took over the day-to-day business of WCW, whilst Brad Siegel would oversee as the new boss, with it suggested that Bush helped orchestrate Bischoff's demise in a power grab. Wanting to hit the ground running, Bush was quick to hire one of the brightest minds behind WWF's Attitude Era resurgence, and less than 1 month after Bischoff's exit, Vince Russo became WCW's new creative director. For Vince Russo and associate Ed Ferrara, WCW needed to become unpredictable again. The two were favored to known a style called Crash TV, meaning that the lines between kayfabe and reality were blurred. Every dial was turned up to 11, and the on-screen product became a 200 miles per hour whirlwind of chaos, with those all-important swerves sprinkled throughout, bro. Whilst Russo's ideas as head writer in WWF had to be signed off by Vince McMahon and his trusted advisors, in WCW he he and Ferrara had free reign and threw a load of sludge at the walls in the hopes that some would stick. Although the standards and practices of Time Warner meant WCW couldn't go as trashy or as far as the WWF was going on a weekly basis, despite Nitro being reclassified as TV-14. Russo and Ferrara sought to give all wrestlers character and storylines no matter their position on the card, a tactic that had worked very well during their time in the WWF. They also booked intertwining storylines and realized that WCW was in dire need of some fresh young stars. To remedy this, they looked to break the likes of Booker T, Chris Benoit, Buff Bagwell, and a returning Jeff Jarrett through the glass ceiling and firmly into the main event scene, whilst transitioning the likes of Hogan and Flair out of it. Good luck with that one. However, they went about their new vision with too much gusto, and rather than building storylines and letting them simmer, Russo and Ferrara would change focus and hurtle through narrative beats at an insane pace, in an effort to try and keep audiences tuned in, with more title changes and swerves than you could shake a stick at. Controversially, they also threw the agreed rules of pro wrestling out of the window, with many insider terms bandied about on TV like jobs, stroke, and other terminology that outright acknowledged that this stuff wasn't real, until they wanted you to believe something was real by scripting someone to go off script. It was all a bit confusing and was catered far too heavily at the dirt sheet reading smart fans online, a fraction of WCW's audience at the time. This scattergun approach to booking was messy, and despite early positive viewing numbers for both Nitro and Thunder, it didn't restore WCW to the #1 spot. Nitro became more about the backstage antics and out-of-the-ring drama than actual wrestling, with whatever graps that did actually occur usually a gimmick-loaded, interference-riddled mess. Indeed, the Crash TV style meant that the actual wrestling was seemingly the least important part of World Championship Wrestling, with a clean finish or a satisfying contest rarer than a 5-star Disco Inferno match. He really was rubbish, wasn't he? This new approach, coupled with no clear progression in viewing figures, caused alarm backstage, especially with veterans such as Kevin Sullivan and JJ Dillon. After an emergency meeting of WCW's veteran management types, Russo would come out swinging after feeling stabbed in the back, pressing on with his plans as Starrcade 99 came into view. The event set to be the culmination of several major storylines. At Starrcade, world champion Bret Hart and Goldberg met in the main event, with Hart defeating Goldberg, as WCW did their own version of the Montreal Screwjob. Fans were furious. Starrcade was now 3 for 3 in terrible endings, and this was the straw that broke the camel's back. Even worse for WCW, this also served as the latest relaunch of the NWO, but it was dead on arrival. Bret Hart was forced to vacate the title and ultimately retire due to an errant kick from Goldberg. And NWO's US champ Jeff Jarrett dropped his belt as well due to injury, which threw Sold Out into chaos. Jeff would be handed his belt back the very next Nitro, of course he was, the cheeky little scamp. Goldberg would also be out of action indefinitely after punching through a legit window and severing an artery in his arm. Backed into a corner and with few healthy stars available, Russo suggested WCW put the world title on former UFC fighter Tank Abbott. The plan was immediately vetoed and was so unpopular an idea that it was decided that a booking committee needed setting up. Russo outright opposed working in a committee and relinquished his status as head writer in protest after just several months in the role. With Russo out, Kevin Sullivan took over as head booker once again, but this itself caused a raft of problems backstage, with a potential mutiny on hand if Sullivan wasn't removed from the role. Regardless, Sullivan was in charge of the booking committee, and a decision was made to finally crown Chris Benoit as World Heavyweight Champion at Sold Out in January 2000. However, Benoit was one of those most displeased at Sullivan's return to the booker's chair, as the two had severe personal animosity towards one another. In protest to Sullivan's promotion, as well as a general dislike for the state of the company, Benoit forfeited the title after 1 day and revealed he wanted out of the promotion to head for the WWF, alongside Dean Malenko, Perry Saturn, and Eddie Guerrero. Their exit was made easier by road agent Mike Graham reportedly pulling a knife on the four men, with WCW jumping in to sever their contracts and send them on their way without incident, without a lawsuit, and without a no-compete period. A little under 2 weeks later, and these radicals were presented as a very big deal when they arrived on Raw is War, with Benoit and Guerrero Guerrero eventually becoming world champions in the organization. Their debut was a massive rating success for Raw, whilst a week later on Nitro, an unscripted Scott Steiner went berserk at Ric Flair on the mic, told viewers to change the channel to the WWF to watch Stone Cold Steve Austin, all punctuated by Big Papa Pump yelling that WCW sucks! He was suspended as a result. WCW was in free fall. They had failed to adequately build new stars, alienated the mid-carders who should have been pushed to the top, and were angering fans with bad content and a stream of no-shows from a roster of checked-out names. A profitable Rare UK tour in early 2000 would only underscore these problems, as over 38,000 fans across 3 arena dates were treated to the Harris Brothers and the Marmalukes on top, whilst advertised stars such as Kevin Nash, Goldberg and Sting were nowhere to be seen. Scott Hall would wrestle his last WCW match in February and would be fired in the summer after 4 years with the promotion. And in March 2000, Sullivan was removed as booker, as Brad Siegel ousted Bill Bush and had convinced Russo to come back to the company, as well as Eric Bischoff. The belief was that Russo and Bischoff would work together to create a modernized WCW that would give a long overdue push to the young stars of the company, whilst effectively using the established names to entice fans back in as WWF continued to batter all things WCW in the ratings. A best of both worlds approach, with Bischoff solely working in a creative consultancy role, acting as a sounding board for the mercurial Russo to make sure his ideas didn't go too far. The pair's grand plan was to reboot WCW, to vacate every title in the company and start again from scratch, with the young up-and-comers in the new blood fighting against the established stars of the Millionaires Club for all of the gold and the glory. A fine idea on paper, but one that ultimately didn't work out. See, you have to build the youth up slowly and purposefully. You can't just say, okay, this green guy you've never heard of is now a main event star. Cheer him and boo DDP. This approach also didn't leave a lot of grey area in the middle, as veteran established talents like Shane Douglas ended up in the new blood, when really, he wasn't really suited to either camp. The reboot Nitro on April the 10th was meant to be the company's big rallying cry, and even featured the controversial debut of reigning ECW World Champion Mike Awesome as he beat down Kevin Nash with a crutch. However, Nitro once again failed to catch fire in the ratings, and although WCW weren't expecting instant success, the numbers would barely improve in the weeks to come. WCW also still craved mainstream attention, and with the cinema release of the WCW-focused Ready to Rumble, movie star David Arquette was brought into the company as an on-screen figure. The decision was soon made to crown Arquette as WCW World Heavyweight Champion, a twofold plan designed to bring eyes to WCW and entice punters into the cinema to see Ready to Rumble. Arquette was against the idea, but his hands were tied, and on the April the 25th edition of Thunder, Scream star David Arquette did what Scott Hall, Eddie Guerrero and Magnum TA would never. He won the title that had previously been around the waists of Flair, Dusty, Chono, Muta, Hogan, Sting and Hart. Despite his win being written as a fluke in the title reign only lasting 2 weeks, it was a major turn-off for fans who had been invested in the company for years. The latest in a long line of FUs at those who gave up their time and money to tune in, week out. To this day, it is seen as one of the worst decisions in pro wrestling history, and Arquette himself has gone on to pay his dues on the indie scene as an apology to the fans, years after donating his WCW earnings to the families of Brian Pillman, Owen Hart, Bobby Duncombe Jr. and Darren Drozdoff. The Arquette saga was an abject failure all round. WCW didn't get a ratings boost or significant mainstream press coverage like they had hoped. They alienated yet more of their fans and pro wrestlers alike, and Ready to Rumble bombed at the box office. It was back to the drawing board. Whether it was Russo beating Flair or Goldberg turning heel, nothing was working. WCW was nonsensical and littered with even more swerves and DQ finishes than ever before, and the numbers continued to drop across the board. Russo and Bischoff were barely on speaking terms, and a stressed Russo took a leave of absence, with Terry Taylor and John Laurinaitis coming in to help Bischoff on the creative front. One person who fans still wanted to cheer was Hulk Hogan, but at Bash at the Beach 2000, Hogan would make his last appearance in a WCW ring, 4 years since the birth of the NWO. Hogan was booked to lose to World Champion Jeff Jarrett at the pay-per-view, but used that notorious creative control clause to avoid doing the job. Plans were reworked, and Jarrett instead laid down in the ring as Hogan got the win with a one-footed pin, before cutting a worked shoot on the recently returned Russo, saying that's why this company is in the damn shape it's in, because of bull poo like this. Bischoff and Hogan would then leave the arena with the belt, with Bischoff claiming that this was all part of a plan to have Hogan return in the long run and set up a champion versus champion clash at Halloween Havoc against an interim champ. However, after the pair left, Vince Russo grabbed a live mic and delivered a scathing shoot on Hogan, the politician, calling him a big, bald son of a bitch and firing him, before setting up Jarrett versus Booker T for the lineal title later in the show. Depending on who you believe, this was either another part of the grand plan, an expert bit of double-crossing, or merely Russo going into business for himself. Regardless, Hogan would attempt to sue Russo for defamation of character over this incident, and Bischoff would unequivocally exit the company. Russo was once again flying solo, and eventually booked himself as champion, Russo having one of 20 different world title reigns in the year 2000. The belt was vacated 6 times in all. The title was already meaningless after Arquette, but Russo holding it somehow lowered its prestige even further. It's just a prop though, bro. Fans were tuning out in their droves, and outside of Booker T and Scott Steiner fully cementing themselves in the main event scene, the latter complete with an actual tiger, there were very few highlights during this period. Not even a Judy Bagwell on a forklift match could turn things around. Despite WCW's downturn in fortunes, they still had the full support of Ted Turner, and remember, as long as Turner was in charge, then WCW were never going to be in major trouble. In early 2000, an agreement was made in principle for Time Warner to merge with AOL in a $350 billion deal. The dot-com bubble was still expanding, and it seemed that the sky was the limit for AOL, with experts tipping AOL to establish itself as the leading media company in this new exciting millennium, whilst Time Warner was seen as decidedly old-fashioned. With this merger, Ted Turner's power was all but gone, but with the mouth of the South being handed a fairly tokenistic vice-chairman role within the new company. As with any massive corporate merger, any assets deemed too expensive or grossly underperforming are usually first for the chopping block, and WCW was staring at the executioner straight in the eye. With Ted no longer in charge, and with WCW's critical and commercial performance plummeting, they were open to attack from the suits that had hated them since day one. Several different outfits, media entities, and entertainment promotion companies began sniffing around WCW, hoping to purchase the struggling promotion. Eric Bischoff was one such name keen on buying the company and running it free from the gaze of corporate pencil pushers, with Bischoff believed to be brokering a deal for WCW on behalf of Mandalay Sports Entertainment. Amongst all of the real-world implications of the Time Warner AOL merger and the future of WCW, a burnt-out, concussed Vince Russo left the company for good, tending his on-screen resignation in October 2000, roughly a year since he was first given the keys to the kingdom. Russo's chaotic year in charge can only be labelled a disaster. TV ratings went into terminal decline, pay-per-view buyer rates plummeted, house show attendances shrank, and whatever viewers were left had to contend with Viagra on a pole matches and a whole host of confusing nonsense. Granted, Russo started in the role with an uphill battle on his hands, and quickly fell foul of the muddied political culture of WCW and the dreaded standards and practices of Time Warner. But the buck, it has to stop with someone. Reports suggested they had lost over $62 million in a year. Although some believe the majority of this figure can be attributed to Time Warner dumping company-wide losses on WCW ahead of the promotion being cleared from the books. Regardless, WCW was in the red, and even worse, they'd lost a hefty chunk of their fan base. 2000 also saw that pesky lawsuit with the WWF wrapped up. Remember the one concerning Diesel and Razor Ramon alleging in storyline that they were sent by the WWF to destroy WCW? Conspiracy theorists still believe this was not a storyline and was a long old plan by Vince McMahon. In January 2001, the Time Warner AOL deal was officially completed. WCW would run their first and only Sin pay-per-view, a show that featured Road Warrior Animal in the main event, Sid horrifically breaking his leg, Goldberg wrestling his last match for the company, and Meng winning the Hardcore title only to exit WCW and emerge as a surprise during the WWF Royal Rumble several days later. The week of Sin, it was confirmed that WCW had been sold, with a consortium known as Fusient Media Ventures tabling the winning bid. This consortium was headed up by faces familiar to WCW staff, with Eric Bischoff and former Time Warner executive Brian Bedell revealed as the team taking control of the floundering giant. In a deal believed to be worth around $67 million, WCW would leave Time Warner AOL's books and would instead become a Fusient property. WCW would remain on TBS channels for years, with TBS itself retaining a minority interest in the promotion. Fusient intended to move WCW's headquarters from Atlanta to Las Vegas, with the intention of building a purpose-built permanent WCW arena in the Hard Rock Hotel as a tourist attraction, allowing the company to save on constant touring fees whilst achieving bags of income from tourists. Bischoff and Bedell were busy negotiating deals with some of their top stars, like Kevin Nash, Scott Steiner, Goldberg, and DDP, whilst bringing in new faces into the company like fresh up-and-coming high flyer AJ Styles. They had also tapped up ECW announcer Joey Styles to handle commentary duties, after Paul Heyman's iconic promotion had gone bankrupt in early 2001, with ECW having drowned amidst ever-rising costs. The plan going forward was yet another refresh of the WCW product, with Scott Steiner on top as the dominant heel champion. WCW was set to go into a planned hiatus in order to build anticipation for their eventual return, with all roads set to lead to a mega event called The Big Bang on May the 6th, with advertising for the show taken out in magazines. Despite announcing the deal in January, it would take up to 60 days until the sale was completed. Then in March 2001, at the 11th hour, new Turner Broadcasting CEO Jamie Kellner decided that WCW didn't fit the new direction that TNT and TBS were moving in, and cancelled Nitro and Thunder on the spot. Without a TV deal and with the stigma of being a cancelled product, the WCW name had become virtually worthless. Unsurprisingly, Fusion's purchase fell through as a result. The March 19th edition of Nitro would see Eric Bischoff call in on the air, telling fans that the March the 26th Nitro in Panama City would be the last WCW show on a Turner channel. The plan was to give WCW a big Night of Champions send-off, as either the planned finish to the season ahead of the Big Bang relaunch, or as a farewell in case a new TV deal could not be sorted elsewhere. By March the 23rd, a sale was back on, but it wasn't to Fusient Media Ventures, it was to Vince McMahon. As part of the Razor Ramon Diesel lawsuit settlement a year earlier, it is believed that Vince McMahon and the WWF had first refusal on WCW should it come up for sale, with McMahon allowed time to match any bid before it was rubber stamped, whether it was for a still functioning company or just mere assets. As WWF had its own TV deals in place, the lack of TV for WCW was no problem. In fact, it was beneficial, as it allowed McMahon to purchase WCW for around $2.5 million. A figure so low that Chris Jericho has since remarked that he would have bought WCW himself had he known how cheap it was. McMahon would spend a further $1.7 million to acquire the WCW library, a grand total of $4.2 million. Quite frankly, a steal, and peanuts in the grand scheme of things. As the March the 26th Nitro came around, it was official. McMahon owned his greatest competitor and ran a historic simulcast edition of Raw is War against Nitro. This allowed Raw to essentially be shown on its home network of USA and also through Nitro on TNT, with tons of backstage bits showing a shy, retiring McMahon humbly saluting the efforts of his greatest competitor. Alright, so Vince McMahon spent hours bigging himself and the WWF up, whilst basically telling the WCW fans who had tuned in that WCW was and always had been total crap. A bit like Black Saturday, but with more venom and vitriol. Vince even threw in a few jabs at Ted Turner for old time's sake, and told WCW's Jeff Jarrett that he could stick his guitar up his own arse. Nitro itself served as a weird half goodbye, half see you soon edition, with the future of the show still up in the air. Last-minute rewrites by WWF staff outlined their vision for the company. US champion Booker T was also crowned world champion. Sting and Ric Flair danced one last time with their wrestling futures uncertain. Whilst they checked out, Tony Schiavone could not hide his displeasure at this new wrestling reality, as he was one of many not going back to work for Vince McMahon. In a storyline twist, it was revealed that Vince's son Shane was the new head of WCW, an added narrative wrinkle to their upcoming clash at WrestleMania X7. A planned run-in by Shane's new employees at Mania was quashed after Sean Stasiak leaked plans, with the WCW wrestlers shown in a box at the Houston Astrodome looking thoroughly bored instead. Regardless, WCW had arrived in the WWF, but were they here to stay? The WWF had won. They had bought out their competition in the forms of WCW and ECW, but were now left with an absolutely stacked roster, and only had so much TV time to showcase it all. Soon, WCW talent started filtering through onto WWF TV. First, Lance Storm arrived with his face like a smacked arse. Then Booker T made a huge splash by suplexing Steve Austin through a table at King of the Ring 2001, whilst Diamond Dallas Page would go after The Undertaker in a frankly crap storyline, insinuating that he was stalking the dead man's wife. A hot start, but this was the peak. Rather than the likes of Kevin Nash, Scott Steiner, Goldberg and Sting showing up next, we instead had lower card acts like Chuck Palumbo, Mark Jindrak, Chronic and Chavo Guerrero Jr. The big-time main eventers of WCW were still under lucrative Time Warner contracts, and only Booker and DDP severed theirs to jump to the WWF straight away. Still, the invasion was on, and although WCW star power was not strong, they were helped by forming an on-screen alliance with ECW. An obvious partnership, seeing all the similarities in tone, style, and presentation between the two companies, as well as the well-publicized close friendship between Eric Bischoff and Paul Heyman. The two interloping companies were banding together to wage war on the WWF, with wrestling fans salivating at the prospect of an all-out war between the three big guns of the late 90s American wrestling boom. It was heavily suggested that heading forward, WCW Nitro would replace Raw on Mondays, with WWF running SmackDown as their main show, an attempt to keep some semblance of a wrestling war alive. TNN, WWF's main broadcast partner on Mondays, balked at the idea. Raw was a major hit and a ratings winner, Nitro a dead brand. Why the hell would they want that? If network fears weren't enough, the nail was firmly put in the coffin of WCW on the July 2nd edition of Raw is War in Tacoma, Washington. The final segment of the show was turned into a WCW broadcast, with Scott Hudson and Arn Anderson calling the action, Nick Patrick on ref duties, Stacy Keibler as the ring announcer, and Buff Bagwell challenging Booker T for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. The WWF fans in attendance had no part of this WCW exhibition. Vince McMahon had spent the best part of the previous decade saying that WCW was crap and that anyone who watched it was a moron. So is it any surprise that his loyal fan base weren't biting? Booker versus Bagwell wasn't the worst match of all time by any means, but it was by no means a good match and was decidedly different from the WWF style at the time. Regardless, the segment was a bust, only saved by an interfering Kurt Angle and Steve Austin being cheered like gods, despite being heels. If WWF really wanted a new WCW to succeed, then they should have waited just one more week, as the very next Raw was live from Atlanta, Georgia, WCW country. Buff was quickly shown the door, but the invasion was still on, with a special pay-per-view set for July the 22nd. The Invasion pay-per-view came to encapsulate the entire invasion angle, and despite being a massive pay-per-view success, it was critically panned, and is seen as possibly the biggest wasted opportunity in wrestling history. Rather than pleasing fans with a true WWF versus WCW war, the invasion just became the latest chapter in the on-screen saga of the McMahons, and was a monumental bit of ego stroking by Vince and Co. As 2001 drew to a close, all major WCW titles were sanctioned in the WWF, with the World Heavyweight Championship, US title, and Cruiserweight title still defended on TV, whilst the WCW tag titles were absorbed into the WWF WWF tag title lineage. WCW as a brand was officially finished at Survivor Series 2001, when the WWF predictably and convincingly won their feud. Then, at Vengeance in December, Chris Jericho would make history by winning the WWF Championship and WCW World Championship in the same night. A far cry to being big leagued by Goldberg just a few years earlier. Another influx of talent soon came into the company, as the big hitters of WCW were now free of contract and were coming to work for Vince McMahon. Ric Flair would re-emerge as an on-screen authority figure, and the NWO was brought in to wreak havoc in early 2002, with Rey Mysterio Jr. and Scott Steiner joining later in the year. After WrestleMania 19 in 2003, Goldberg would also join the company and would continue his main event run, for a little while at least. The most surprising face to turn up on WWE TV was that of Eric Bischoff, with hell seemingly freezing over as he shared a hug with Vince McMahon on Raw before becoming an authority figure in his own right. There's definitely an argument to be made that if WWF waited just 1 year, then a full-scale WCW invasion could have been headline-grabbing business, but hindsight is always 2020. The extra influx of talent saw WWE split Raw and SmackDown into opposing shows, with talent drafted between the two in an on-air Raw special. Basically, the WWF SmackDown versus WWF own Nitro plan, but in a different guise. The Monday Night Wars were over, the Attitude Era was a thing of the past, and World Championship Wrestling was dead. As WWE sat unopposed atop the wrestling world once more, the wrestling boom significantly cooled off in the hearts and minds of regular everyday people. Without true competition, WWE became more insular, more isolated, and decidedly more corporate, with wrestling officially labelled a dirty word as ratings slowly declined. A new wave of independent promotions cropped up across America, some trying to fill the hardcore void left by ECW, whilst others, like Ring of Honor, sought to take wrestling back to its sporty roots. Many WCW names would find themselves passing through these promotions. Then there were the Jarretts. Jeff was ostracized from WWE after walking out and back into WCW arms in 1999, whilst his dad Jerry failed in a potential takeover of WCW in its dying days. The two gathered up those stars too big for the indies, but with no place in WWE, and also brought along WCW staff like Mike Tenay, Jeremy Borash, and Bob Ryder to develop total non-stop action wrestling out of Nashville. TNA was a spiritual successor to WCW in many ways, and the company even mended that relationship with the NWA. Whilst Rey Mysterio, Eddie Guerrero, Booker T, and others would thrive in the WWE, one man stayed away and made his way to TNA instead. That man known as Sting. The true franchise player of WCW, Sting stayed away from Vince McMahon's clutches for many years, until he eventually joined WWE for a short run in late 2014. Of course, this run was turned into one last middle finger to WCW, with Triple H handily defeating the Stinger in his debut at WrestleMania 31. Sting flanked by the NWO for reasons which still make absolutely no bastarding sense at all. Eric Bischoff would have stints in and out of WWE over the following decades as both on-screen talent and a behind-the-scenes creative mind. He too would end up in TNA alongside Hulk Hogan, but their attempt to go head-to-head with Raw was embarrassing to say the least, and almost tanked the company. Vince Russo would also have several runs in TNA, but audience were wise to his preferred style of wrestling, and whenever they saw something truly crap or convoluted, they would chant "Fire Russo" in protest, even if the angles in question weren't his idea. His name is still a divisive one in the pro wrestling world, and a byword for when someone unsuccessfully tries to blur kayfabe and reality. Ted Turner would have no more involvement in professional wrestling after WCW, with Turner eventually stepping away from day-to-day corporate life to oversee major conservation projects in America. Ted would be left apoplectic by the AOL Time Warner merger, with the company losing over $200 billion in what is now seen as one of the worst deals in business history. It almost makes WCW's losses seem alright by comparison. Whilst WWE would revive ECW for several pay-per-views and its own disastrous run on TV, there was no such reunion show for WCW. WCW content did form the backbone of the WWE Network when it was launched in 2014, with WWE even bringing back WCW show names out of retirement. Tournament. Annual Halloween Havoc and the Great American Bash events are still produced by WWE to this day, whilst War Games has become one of the marquee events of the year. But what is WCW's true legacy? The WWE have understandably attempted to rewrite history overwhelmingly in their favour. As to the victor goes the spoils. But whilst it's easy to laugh at the terrible angles, disastrous TV switches, and nonsensical booking of late-stage WCW, that's just a small part of the legacy of what was at one point the biggest wrestling property in the world. There's the excellent in-ring work of the early days of the company, with feuds like Flair vs Steamboat, Flair vs Funk, and well, Flair vs anyone standing the test of time. There's the innovative cruiserweight division of the mid-90s, itself influencing an entire generation of stars. The move to live primetime TV every week was a WCW innovation still practiced by the WWE to this day, whilst WWE's adoption of a monthly pay-per-view schedule came as a response to WCW's growing pay-per-view business. Whilst the NWO did lead to the rise of the cool heel, it did completely change the business for the better. Wrestling will never likely be as hot as it was in the late 90s, and that boom was caused squarely by those naughty lads in the black and the white. To this day, NWO shirts still sell like hotcakes, with groups the world over attempted to capture the initial rebellious aura of Hall, Nash, and Six. WWE would eventually find some semblance of competition in the form of All Elite Wrestling, with Tony Khan's outfit bringing wrestling back to TNT and TBS after nearly 20 years away. AEW would be dubbed by detractors for being WCW light when things went wrong, while supporters would revel in hearing Tony Schiavone excitedly scream, "It's Sting!" once more, or for Cody Rhodes attempting to keep his father and indeed WCW spirit alive with Bash at the Beach shows and an on-screen reunion of Arn Anderson and Tully Blanchard. Nostalgia is one hell of a drug. The old adage was that WWF was a wrestling company producing TV, whilst WCW was a TV company that featured wrestling. Now, with AEW's in-ring product garnering widespread praise, some have turned that criticism around onto the WWE, with AEW the promotion punching up against the multi-billion-dollar corporate entity. Interestingly, there have been many rumoured potential relaunches of WCW over the years, but nothing concrete ever came of them. A subsidiary of Time Warner called the Universal Wrestling Corporation, the original name for WCW upon Turner's buyout in 1988, existed until December 2017, but was little more than a forgotten corporate mailbox kept alive to deal with the ongoing legal matters after WCW's demise. For many, the fitting end for WCW came in the summer of 2022, when the NWA hosted Ric Flair's last match. Whilst the match itself was terrible and Flair himself looked on the verge of actual death, it was fitting to see Nate reunited with the real big gold belt as Jim Crockett promotion banners were hoisted one last time. So here's to you, World Championship Wrestling, the catalyst for the hottest period in wrestling history, and for us that lived through it, what a time it was indeed.